So the talk is going to be about cities in the ecological age, which, if it's not the age that we're in already, I very much hope it's the direction in which we are going, moving out of the fossil fuel, the oil age. And I think actually Lars has much more clearly than perhaps I could explained what I hope to talk about today. So perhaps I'll just start by very quickly telling you a little bit about the company that I represent, Arup, for those of you who don't know us. We're a large consultancy firm, about 10,000 people, spread across 90 offices, 35 different countries around the world, including a project office here in Copenhagen, where we're working on the metro, amongst other projects. And indeed, as Henning mentioned, I've been working on a project for the city of Copenhagen, which actually is looking at the success story of green Copenhagen and how the lessons that have been learned here can be transferred to other cities around the world, many of whom I work for. But we're a company that started life very much as a building engineering consultancy through our founder, Arup, who is somewhere between a quarter and a half Danish. I can't remember the precise lineage. And that's still a big part of what we do today, working on iconic projects like the Beijing Olympic Stadium and the Sydney Opera House. But we do a huge range of other things these days, right across the built environment, and indeed through to the sort of management consultancy type services across all of the sort of infrastructure that cities rely on: energy, waste, water, and transport. And perhaps for a company of our size, we're slightly unusual in that we have no partners and no shareholders. We're in effect a cooperative, and that means that we can operate in a very different way to many of our competitors. We reinvest a huge proportion of our profits back into the firm, but particularly into areas where we think the world is moving or needs to move, or where our staff have a particular interest. And that's very relevant for the work that I've been doing and a lot of other people in Arup have been doing around the whole sustainability agenda, and in particular in tackling climate change in urban areas. So I've chosen to focus on cities in the ecological age rather than the world in general in terms of sustainability, for the very simple reason that cities represent now over half of humanity and about 80% of carbon emissions and energy consumption. The figures on the screen here are actually just representing the population and the carbon emissions of the 40 biggest capital cities of the world, the C40 group, for whom I work. And one can see when one sort of glances at those figures just how critical this very small number of cities and the leaders of those cities are to tackling the problem of climate change. 10% of carbon emissions and around 300 million people. And if one takes the sort of triple problems that the world is grappling with at the moment, of climate change, of fossil fuel depletion, and of wider resource depletion, including dwindling per capita food supplies at the moment and water resources, etc., all of the roads from those problems lead back to cities, because it's cities that are where the consumption of most of those resources are taking place. So the basis for a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to be derived from the work that we've been doing for the C40 group of cities, which are the ones represented on the map here. They are a group of 40 of the biggest cities in the world, mostly capital cities, which represented by their mayors, which have come together to try and collaborate to tackle climate change, starting in 2005, and in response to the failure of national governments and international treaties to move quickly enough on climate change. And as Henning said, this is an organisation that I was very much involved in establishing for my former boss, the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. Arup has been working for the C40 for the last 2 years as their strategic advisors, and in particular we've been doing capacity building work in one city in each of the 6 continents where the bigger blobs are on the screen there: Toronto, Sao Paulo, Addis Ababa, Warsaw, Ho Chi Minh and Melbourne. But we advise the C40 group as a whole, and indeed we've just produced a report for them, Climate Action in Megacities, which analyses the carbon emissions of each of the 40 member cities, the powers available to those mayors to tackle climate change, the actions that they've taken to date, and looking at that comparatively, but then most importantly, what are the opportunities for them to accelerate their action in the future. So I say that just as background because most of the data that I'm going to use for the rest of the talk is derived from this study and the work from the C40, as well as my experience working for a city government in London. So, if one is trying to look at what are the cities of the future going to look like in the ecological age, one needs to know where they start from and where they aspire to go. And I'm taking climate change as a proxy for ecological age, although obviously there's a lot more to sustainability than that. And the first thing to note is that cities start from very, very different places. This is just a comparison between some of the cities that we've been working for in the C40, and it's showing per capita carbon emissions across those cities. The solid line is real data, the dotted line is the projections from the city mayors themselves. And you can see there's a dramatic difference between Melbourne at 20 tonnes of carbon per person to Addis Ababa, which barely registers above zero. It's about 0.1, with the sort of North American and European cities clustered around the sort of 6 to 10 mark. I don't actually have Copenhagen's figures on here, but I guess it's quite similar to Stockholm in there, now down to about 3 or 4 tonnes per person. And when you look at those figures and sort of talk to the mayor in Melbourne, who we have been working for, he would say, of course, yeah, well, that's true. We've got a terrible carbon footprint, but it's not really our fault. Our problem as a city is the carbon intensity of the national grid. In Australia, electricity production is largely based on very dirty coal, and it means that the energy consumed by Australians is considerably more carbon intensive than, for example, Brazil down in the bottom right-hand corner, which has a very large amount of hydroelectricity in its grid mix. And that's true, but it's not actually a reason for excusing inactivity, because when we started working with Melbourne, we found that even if one factored in the carbon intensity, or factored out the carbon intensity of the grid, you still found that the average Melburnian consumes about 25% more energy than the average European, which is, and if you further kind of factor out kind of climatic conditions and the need for cooling, it's still about 10 or 15% higher. And that's purely down to actually the consumption of very large electrical equipment like this and the lifestyle of Melburnians, which at the moment doesn't really take into account any need to reduce their carbon emissions. So our view from looking around most of the big cities of the world is there really isn't a barrier for those cities being able to reduce their carbon footprint by the kind of dramatic numbers that the international climate community would argue for, a 50% reduction across the world as a whole and an 80% reduction in the developed world cities. A word of caution though, if we just sort of flick back a little bit, you see on the projections for all of the cities are quite steep reductions in their carbon footprint in the next 10 years, in some cases very steep reductions even in the next 5 years. You can't, as with any statistics, one can't be entirely convinced by these. This slightly complicated graph is just showing the difference between the current Mayor of London's plans for carbon reduction, Boris Johnson, and the previous Mayor, Ken Livingstone. Both have adopted the same target, which is a 60% reduction against 1990 levels by 2025. But whereas Ken Livingstone's proposals were about half based on measures that he could take himself with the budgets available to him as a mayor. When Boris Johnson came into power, he kept the same target, but then rebased all the figures, assumed the future was much rosier than Ken Livingstone had done, and therefore that emissions would tail off more naturally, and then decided that the government bore a lot more responsibility than he did for tackling climate change, and therefore reduced the contribution that he would make himself by about half. So one has to watch out for that across all of the cities. However, having said that, and this is coming from the recent study we've done from the C40, When you start looking at the powers available to city governments to tackle climate change, they're very significant. And as a very, very broad brush sort of statement, I would say that a city mayor of the big cities in the world can probably deal with about half of the necessary carbon emission reductions in their cities with the powers available to them. This is just a breakdown here of the number of the mayors within the C40 that have strong powers across the major sectors of infrastructure that are necessary for tackling climate change. And you can see that the powers are strongest around buildings and around transport. In buildings, particularly because of large ownership of municipal buildings, but also 17 of those mayors have very strong regulatory powers over commercial buildings. In transport, very significant ownership of roads, of traffic light systems, and of public transport systems, particularly around buses. But even when you start going down through things like outdoor lighting and waste and water, over half the mayors in the C40 have the powers at their disposal to radically change the energy consumption and the patterns of use of all of those major forms of infrastructure. And that's true to a slightly lesser extent, but still quite significant in terms of planning and developing the urban environment. We found that 15 of the 40 cities had very strong powers to determine the future shape of the city through their planning powers. So it's a number that's sort of slightly meaningless, except for that it's quite big. When we analysed all the actions that these cities have been taking over the last 5 years, we found 4,734 separate actions have been taken to tackle climate change. Doesn't mean a lot on its own. If you break that down, though, 36 cities from which we had data, that means about 130 separate actions per city. If you'd done the same survey a few years ago, it would have been 5, 6, 7, with some exceptions like Copenhagen. So most of the big cities are taking climate change and sustainability relatively seriously now. The activity very much follows the pattern of where there is power. So the biggest number of actions, that 1,343 number, is to reduce energy use in buildings, followed by transport, which is usually about trying to change patterns of transport demand. And that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to try now and go through some of those major sectors and look at the current state of sustainability in some of these big cities, and then what are the opportunities for the future. Starting with transport, because probably that's the most significant area and the most difficult for many mayors to tackle. So this graph is just looking at carbon emissions from the transport sector across the C40 cities measured against GDP per capita. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it shows a rising emissions as wealth increases as a general pattern, but actually you can see that there's some exceptions. There's a cluster of cities that are amongst the wealthiest in the C40 that have some of the lowest carbon emissions, those down in the bottom right-hand corner there. And they tend to be the ones that have developed a compact city model based on public transport and with an increasing degree of mobility through walking and cycling. And here, the correlation between the powers in the transport sector and over urban land use are critical to achieving this change. Similarly, there are some cities with pretty low per capita incomes but whose emissions from transport are really starting to rise quite rapidly. And they tend to be the Latin American and East Asian cities in particular, where population and economic growth has been explosive, and there's a real shift to car travel where previously there was much more cycling in particular. So looking at what cities might need to do in order to reverse the general trend of rising emissions from transport, and if you take the International Energy Agency's projections for future oil demand, 97% of increased demand for oil over the next 15 years will come from the transportation sector. That's primarily due to an explosion in the number of cars expected to be on the road from about 1 billion today to 2 billion by 2030. My starting point, therefore, is one has to reverse that trend, regardless of alternative fuels, electric vehicles, etc. Cities will simply be unmanageable for a number of reasons, including traffic congestion, if their growth is dependent on the car. Therefore, we have to have a dramatic shift to public transport, cycling and walking. And it is inevitable, in my view, that will, therefore, cities will have to turn to road pricing, so putting up the price of driving a car so significantly that a large number of people are forced into different options. This has been tried, and that's to put it in the very negative terms rather than the positive, but just to get the point across. This has been achieved now very successfully in a number of cities, starting with London and its congestion charge project I worked on from its inception, where as a result of a charge which is now 10 euros a day, started out at about 5 euros a day back in 2003, the number of vehicles entering central London on a working day has been cut by 70,000, which is a reduction of about 20% in the morning peak, with a cut in carbon emissions of about 15% as a result, but a major reduction in congestion. It was a very controversial policy, as it is in every country where it's been proposed, and indeed of all the measures that we surveyed looking across the C40 cities, the one that's been started and then later ditched due to popular disapproval the most is road pricing. So it's a very hard one for mayors to bring in. Nevertheless, some other cities have done this now, Stockholm and Milan in particular, and other cities like Seoul and Beijing have introduced something similar. The usual argument when one talks about this in other cities, however, is that, okay, we understand that it works in London, you had such a terrible traffic congestion problem. We understand why it works in Stockholm, they're different to everybody else, but it won't work in our city, the public just won't buy it. And actually, most people in London at the point at which the congestion charge was being introduced said the same in London. It just can't be done here. And the opinion polls at the time tended to agree with that. The red line here is showing opposition to the congestion charge and the green line support. And you can see in the months leading up to its introduction in February 2003, there was growing opposition to the policy and more people opposed it than wanted it introduced. Most of the media thought it was going to be the end of Ken Livingstone's political career when he introduced it. Election in a year's time, and it would be so unpopular, he would be ousted. And I don't think there's any other politician, certainly in Britain, who would have introduced it, given that sort of opinion polling. Ken, however, was determined. He was certain it was the right thing for London, and he was certain that Londoners would support it once they'd seen it in practice, which is exactly what happened. Within just a few weeks of the charge coming into action, you can see a huge change in public opinion, which has pretty much stabilised ever since, about 55% in favour, 25% against. And the simple reason for that was the vast majority of people never drive in central London during the working week. They couldn't afford to in the first place because it's so expensive and there aren't enough parking spaces. But intensive media campaigns had convinced people that the congestion charge would affect them, and it wasn't until it came in that they realised it didn't. The only big change there's been in public opinion since was when the mayor proposed and then introduced, doubled the size of the congestion charge, and again, big media scare stories and public opinion came very close together again. So the real lesson I draw from that is it's perfectly possible to do road pricing, but you have to work in a political system where it's possible for you to introduce the charge before the electorate have to take a decision on it. There was an election a year after the charge was introduced in London, and therefore it was possible to introduce. In Manchester, where a vote was taken before the charge was introduced, it was lost. And in New York, the mayor was unable to convince the state legislature to introduce the charge for the same reason. The really big impact, though, of the congestion charge in London, and perhaps the bigger lesson for other cities, was that it allowed a dramatic change in public transport in London, particularly the use of the bus. And the bus in London in 2000 had become something that was seen as the kind of the poor man's public transport. Indeed, Margaret Thatcher, our former Prime Minister, very famously said that if you see a man, and she was very gender specific, if you see a man over the age of 30 on a bus, you know you're looking at a failure. And that kind of psychology had really started to take a grip of people, and indeed it had become true. But part of the reason for that was underinvestment in the bus system just meant it was completely unreliable, very slow, rather dirty, and not a nice way to travel. By bringing in the congestion charge, we were able to completely change that, because suddenly pretty much all of the bus routes in London go through the centre at some point. Suddenly, rather than getting completely bogged down in the centre of London and losing their timetable, the buses were able to move more freely. We were able to create road space for buses, creating priority lanes, and put a huge investment, over £500 million a year for 8 years, €500 million a year for 8 years, into the bus system. Brand new buses, 8,000 new buses across the whole of London. Every single route in London had more buses operating more frequently with greater reliability, all with CCTV. The fares were reduced and then held down in real terms for the whole of Ken Livingstone's period in charge. And there was an explosion in the use of the bus, almost a 50% increase in bus passengers over a period of 8 years. But it's not just rich cities that have been able to use the bus to dramatically change travel patterns. It's very noticeable that in Latin America, all of the 6 Latin American members of the C40 have now introduced these bus rapid transit systems, which probably most people are familiar with, but which started famously in Curitiba and then in Bogota, and are simply express bus lanes down the centre of the road, but with metro-style passenger facilities. So a raised sort of platform in the middle of the road that means that bus passengers just can get on a flat platform onto the bus with very good bus shelters and easy access to the bus stops and plenty of space for queuing, so that the whole journey experience is much improved. And indeed, in Curitiba, the success of the bus rapid transit system there is often put down to the fact that the mayor who introduced it, Jaime Lerner, was an architect and therefore put a huge amount of effort into making sure that the system looked very good and was very functional, and was also very functional. And these systems in Bogota, the figures there, cut greenhouse gas emissions 32% and decreased accident rates by 40%. And having just been in Sao Paulo for the last week, where on one journey I made, it took 2 hours by car for an hour and a half walk. These are systems that they desperately need, but which are now being transferred to other places around the world. But the really big change that I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years working with cities on their transport policies is the return of the bike, I'm very, very pleased to say, as a committed cyclist. And in fact, when we measured the actions that the C40 cities are taking on transport, cycling ranked as the area with the highest number of actions across all of the 40 cities, which it would be completely impossible to even conceive of saying that even just 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, I can remember at a conference 4 or 5 years ago when the Mayor of London suggested that he was going to base his transport policy on a rapid increase in cycling, that the rest of the audience of mayors laughed at him openly because they thought it was so ridiculous. Obviously here you've got a very different view based on years of successful cycling. But in fact it's that experience from places like Copenhagen that's really been transferred across the other cities within the C40 network that has changed those attitudes. But there's still huge possibility for change. This graph here is just showing within each of the regions of the C40 the difference between the city with the lowest level of modal share for cycling and the city with the highest, so that you can factor out the kind of geographical and cultural and other differences. And that you can see in pretty much all of the regions, with the exception of the USA and Canada, where just basically no cities have very much cycling. There's huge potential for growth in cycling. Europe, the highest, because Copenhagen's there at the top with a 38% modal share. Africa, unfortunately, is the only, although there is actually a lot of cycling in Africa, it's not really recorded by the city, so I think those stats don't really tell the true story. But certainly there's very little emphasis in African cities at the moment, of the ones that we've been working with, on moving towards cycling, and it's something that one hopes does change, because at the moment they're largely building roads for cars. So if the starting point has got to be, in my view, to change patterns of demand for transport, using pricing mechanisms, investing heavily in public transport to enable people to have a real choice to move out of their car, but then focusing on cycling wherever possible, and really I think putting cycling at the top of the transport tree, using things like the sort of cycle hire programs that have now become so popular in Paris and Mexico City and London and elsewhere. There still is a major role for road vehicle transport, of course, but one has to think about how it can be fuelled in a different way. And whilst I think there are real regional differences in the way that cities are and should approach this problem, for example, in Latin America, there's a big focus on biofuels derived from sugar, which they can do relatively sustainably, with some problems around rainforest depletion. In the majority of cities, electric vehicles are probably going to be the direction in which they're moving, and indeed it's the area where there's a huge amount of activity across city leaders. The problem that we see at the moment, however, is that cities seem to be investing their efforts in a rather sort of skewed way. They have very little control over cars, lots of control over buses and taxis, but all of their efforts are going into electric cars because that's the thing that kind of captures the public imagination. It's also the area where, although there's a lot of investment from industry, it's going to be very many years before one gets to widespread use of electric vehicles, simply because of the extent to which charging infrastructure will need to be put in place to allow people to use their vehicles and to overcome the sort of range anxiety that people feel that a 100-kilometre charges may not be enough to serve their needs. Although, in fact, across the C40 cities, over 90% of trips by car are under, well under 100 kilometres. Where we see, therefore, real potential for development is in the use of inductive charging for electric vehicles, particularly in relation to buses and taxis. Inductive charging, which is simply the sort of technology that recharges your electric toothbrush, enables there to be pads inserted in the road, which when the vehicle stays stationary over for a short period of time, can do a very quick charge into the battery. And it means for vehicles that are moving on patterns that are pretty regular, so buses that go the same route every day, stop at a bus stop for a minute at a time, and at the end of their journey maybe stop in a bus depot for a few minutes at a time, or taxis which stop on taxi ranks. It means that vehicles can be continuously charged, which has huge financial implications as well as carbon implications, because it means that the size of the electric battery can be reduced by a factor of about 5. And given that it's the battery that makes electric vehicles more expensive than the diesel or petrol alternatives, this is hugely significant. So from some work we've been doing recently in the city of Warsaw, which is looking to invest in electric vehicles, we now find that we think that they can invest in an electric bus in Warsaw, which, even taking into account putting in place the induction charging infrastructure, will still be slightly cheaper than if they were to buy the equivalent diesel bus, which is a huge breakthrough for the industry and will mean a rapid increase in the use of electric vehicles if that turns out to be true. And finally, because I think we must be getting to the end of the half hour. Yeah? Okay. Finally, moving from keeping with some of the things that we've been looking at in Eastern Europe, in Warsaw, where we've been working recently, they've got a growing traffic congestion problem, but a real cultural attachment to the car. And again, it's the second case recently where we stood up and sort of proposed a policy and been laughed at by the city administration in the first meeting, although then they've changed. Because we've been talking to the city of Warsaw through the C40 about the potential for car clubs, sort of called car sharing in some cities, where rather than owning a car, people are members of a club, have access to a vehicle that's parked on their street or very nearby, which they access with some kind of electronic ticketing device, book it online for very short periods of time, an hour or 2 hours. And the response in Warsaw initially was, there is no way this will catch on here, because people see a car as a sign of success. So having a shared car means that you're a failure. This was also the attitude in London until very recently. Until 2005, there were no car club cars in London. There are now 100,000 members of car clubs and just over 1,500 cars in London, and growing exponentially. It's also a policy that's been quite successful, surprisingly, in the US. In Boston, 5% of the population are now members of a car club. And the reason I think it's worth mention, and I think a lot of cities will start to be taking up this policy, is fairly simple. For every car club car that's put on the road, in London at least, 20 private cars come off the road over a period of time. Because the vast majority of members, once they've joined the car club, find that they just don't need their old car anymore. If you look at that in financial terms, the Mayor in London has invested about €500,000 a year for 5 years in car clubs to get up to 100,000 members. That's because this is a commercially viable proposition, so there's been a lot of private investment. But nevertheless, about €2.5 million over 5 years. And if you go through the figures, it's reduced vehicle trips by car by about 30,000 per day. You contrast that, 2.5 million for 30,000 vehicles, with the cost of the congestion charge, which was €250 million and took 70,000 vehicles off the road. And suddenly this becomes an extremely cost-effective way of dealing with traffic congestion and reducing emissions from cars. So our view is that this is although it's not a particularly sort of sexy policy, it's one that's probably going to catch on across many cities in the world. But finally, to sort of go from perhaps the easy to the bravest, for the mayors that are really brave, they would follow the example of the Mayor of Seoul, who got sick of the, is it 8 or 6, I can't remember, 8-lane highway going right through the middle of his city, which was causing huge air pollution, noise pollution, as well as traffic congestion, and preventing the city from having a real heart, and decided he'd just rip it out completely. So just took the entire highway out, unearthed the stream that had been flowing beneath it, that had been covered up, and created almost overnight a major tourist destination in the city, a place that people flock to at their lunch times, changed the character of the centre of the city, but also because it created this massive sort of flow of air through the middle of the city and took out all of the heat from the cars and pollution from the cars, reduced the ambient temperature in the city on some days by up to 3 degrees, which in a city like Seoul, which gets some really extreme temperatures, has been very significant. Haven't found a single other mayor that's willing to do something like that yet, but there are plenty of cities that could do so. One of the questions was, where did all the traffic go in this? Which, the answer is basically it was absorbed into public transport. Big increases in the public transport system. But I believe, although I'd have to check the figures, I believe that Seoul is one of those cities that has had a small reduction in the number of car trips, which is very unusual because most big cities are seeing rapid expansion. Anyway, moving on from transport to looking at buildings. And again, these are figures from the C40 group of cities, and showing that the energy consumed in buildings is in many of the cities across the C40 the single most important source of carbon emissions, and therefore, from the point of view of tackling climate change, the area where they really have to focus. That's particularly true in the US and Canada, but also increasingly in the rapidly growing cities of East Asia. Much less so in Latin America, primarily because the nexus between the atmospheric conditions and wealth is such that there's not a lot of need for heating, and there isn't a lot of money to pay for cooling, which reduces energy consumption quite considerably. This is probably, however, the bit that's maybe not very popular with an audience of architects. But when one starts to look at what the big cities are focusing on in terms of sustainability, climate change, and buildings, instead of finding a desire to knock down and rebuild and how can we build wonderful new low-carbon buildings, actually the vast majority of effort and thinking amongst the big city leaders now is going on how we retrofit existing buildings. And indeed, that seems to make sense when one... I haven't got that. I thought I had the statistics. And when one starts to look at the statistics, the average estimates across the European and North American cities is that well over half of the buildings that are in use today in those cities will still be in use in 2050 when the target of an 80% reduction in carbon emissions has to be achieved. And from that sort of point of view alone, one has to focus very much on how you retrofit those buildings. There's a huge amount of discussion amongst the cities, though, about what's the best way of going about that. At the moment, most of the activity is around the retrofitting of municipal office buildings, schools, those that are directly within the control of the city. Berlin is probably the city that's doing most, and which many of the other cities within the C40 at least are following very concretely. Actually, it was for issues completely unrelated to climate change that Berlin started a major program of retrofitting its buildings about 10 years ago. It was actually because the city was going bankrupt, and the only basis on which the state government would loan them more money was if that they were able to confirm that they were able to radically reduce the costs of running the city government in the long term. And they found that actually the most cost-effective way of doing that was to dramatically reduce the energy consumption within their very large building stock. And the state government advanced the money to do that, and is repaid effectively out of the energy savings that accrue through the retrofitting of those buildings. And over the course of the last 10 years, they've now retrofitted, I think it's about 1,400 buildings, with an average financial saving of about 10 million euros a year, but a carbon reduction of 26% on average across those buildings. So it's had a very big effect. And the model that they've developed to do that, which is a kind of energy performance contracting model, whereby a private sector ESCO contractor comes in and carries out the works at their cost, and is then repaid out on delivery out of a portion of the energy savings that accrue, is one that's now seems very attractive, and 20 of the other 40 member cities in the C40 have started similar programs with their own building stock. The biggest of which is Toronto, which is the Mayor's Tower Renewal Programme, which is on the slide here, where the former Mayor David Miller started a programme to retrofit 1,000 residential blocks across the city, which, because of their scale, account for about 30% of the residential population, with a very ambitious target to do that in the space of 10 or 15 years. So it's an area which, one Arup certainly is needing to address, because the demand from our clients is now pushing us in the direction of how do we change the way that the existing buildings that we may have designed or been part of designing many years ago now operate, partly driven by cost savings, but also by the knowledge that the way that the public regulation is going is that in all likelihood in many of the places where we work, administrations are going to be imposing charges on building owners and landlords who don't meet more stringent carbon targets in the future. And Hong Kong is probably the city that's starting to lead that, first in a voluntary way at the moment, but it's delivered a major carbon audit program, they call it, across not just the public sector but also the commercial building stock, to, in the first case, report on carbon emissions across buildings, but in the longer term, it's expected that will lead to changes in taxation. So it makes kind of rather boring reading, but when you look therefore at the things that cities are really focusing on in relation to their buildings, it is this rather sort of straightforward stuff of putting in more insulation, not something you probably have to do very much of in Denmark because your building standards are so much higher than most of the other cities I work in, but in many places that can achieve on its own emissions reductions of 10 or 20%. At the sort of higher tech end, the use of smart metering and building management systems to automatically control energy use within buildings, but actually most of the interventions are relatively small, and it's the cumulative effect of them that adds up to having a big effect. And this sort of slightly complicated graph is showing you in the kind of blue blocks the number of cities that are taking actions across these different measures that are down on the left-hand side, and then the percentage figures on the right are the lever that they use to do them. And essentially, where it's a project or a programme, you can pretty much assume that means that those buildings are owned by the administration. So you can see that there are, in a number of cases, particularly around the use of tax incentives to drive lower carbon buildings, there are a small number of cities who are starting to impose the same sort of regulation that they're applying to their own buildings on the commercial sector also. And I would say after transport, within the big cities that we work for, this issue of how you retrofit buildings is the one that's at the very top of city mayors' agenda in terms of their climate policy. And that's true not just in North America and Europe and the richer East Asian cities where you might expect it, but actually across most of the network. The circles here, the size of the circle indicates the scale of building retrofit activity, which is a slightly coarse measure. It's just the number of actions that are taking place measured on a rather large survey that we did. So it doesn't completely tell you the scale of activity, but nevertheless you can see that with the exception of North Africa, pretty much all of the regions of the C40 have got relatively major building retrofit activity underway at the moment. So those things are really, in the sort of transport and the building retrofit, are areas where mayors have powers and control right now and can take measures that will have relatively immediate effect. Big reductions in emissions, major changes to lifestyle, improvements in broader sustainability in a period of 5 to 10 years. But when one looks at the total quantity of carbon that needs to be reduced and the total change to the sustainability of a city, one needs much more than just those rather rapid measures. And this is a very sort of generic graph, but to try and illustrate the sort of size of the tasks ahead. So broadly speaking, those sort of building retrofit transport kind of interventions are things that can be done in the next 5, 10, 15 years, have a significant effect, but modest in comparison to the really two sort of big areas here. The first of which is greening the grid, changing the way that energy is supplied onto a renewable energy basis. But then actually the biggest of all, which is we call it the urban form here, changing the design of the city as a whole, usually taken within these sort of big city context to moving to more of the kind of compact city model of Europe and away from the Northern American sprawl car-based sort of policy. And I would say that's the for the cities that we work with, that's the area at the moment that gets lots of kind of attention in theory, lots of discussion at conference, but not a lot of movement because it's just seen as too big and too difficult. And in fact, I was saying in one of the conversations in the break, the Copenhagen is undoubtedly seen as the green leader within this network of C40 cities. It's an affiliate member because it's not big enough to be a full member, but it's the city along with Stockholm that most of the other cities look to. But it's really noticeable for me working with your political leaders here compared to many of my other clients that there's just a very different philosophy. They really are prepared. And you may have a more jaundiced view as you live and work in the city, but they really are prepared to think about the long term and think about the policies in the context of what it will mean for the city, the development of the city as a whole. In most places, it's very, very difficult to get administrations to focus on anything further away than the next election, sort of three or 4 years, and that makes this sort of bigger stuff much more difficult to cope with. But the very sort of broad model that, the kind of perfect world that one wants to do is to move away from this kind of Los Angeles type horrible congestion sort of sprawl to the kind of, what would you do if you had a blank sheet of paper and can design a wonderful new eco-city in China, which indeed this is an illustration from one of the projects that Arup has been working on in China. And I would say most of the cities in the C40 would now take that as to be a sort of aspiration. Even that wouldn't have been true a few years ago. And indeed, there are still a few cities that are kind of really struggling with how to change. Addis Ababa, where we've been working over the last year, and which has had really extraordinary population and economic growth in recent years, going from a population in the high hundreds of thousands in the late 1960s to officially about 4 million today, but actually probably closer to 6 or 7 million. achieved economic growth of over 10% for the last 10 years running, which has enabled them to invest very rapidly in changing the city. So only 10 years ago, 80% of people living in Addis Ababa lived in slum areas, in makeshift homes with no proper sanitation, no water, and no real formal electricity supply. That number's down to 40% today, so it's still massive, but a huge change. And a massive construction program that's going on behind this. You really can't turn in any direction in the city without seeing a crane. However, the model that they've imported at the moment is one based on that kind of North American model. So there are now a massive 8-lane ring road all around the city and 8-lane superhighways going through the centre of the city, most of which at the moment are used by pedestrians and people with donkeys. And you know there are some cars, and there are a lot of these taxis, these blue and white taxis, and a lot of Chinese buses. But you know the intention is clear. Success means cars, and we're going to have lots of them, and we've built the roads to make ready. The current mayor is trying to rethink that policy, and we've been helping them through the C40 try and work out how they can replan the city to build it on a more compact basis and a more sustainable basis. But that means lots of investment now so that the right decisions are made at the outset. And it's a sort of politically difficult situation because the aspiration to be like the West is so great. So the other sort of large area where the long-term impact will be greatest in terms of achieving climate change targets is obviously around renewable energy supply. And I've deliberately left this till last because actually, from a city government point of view, it's the area where mayors have the least powers. We found only 4 cities within the C40 that have any direct control over major energy supply within their cities, and that's, in all cases, that's district heating systems of some scale. Very few have any kind of regulatory control, only 8 have any level of regulatory control. However, that doesn't mean that mayors aren't doing something about it. So 18 of the 40 mayors have pretty significant targets to increase renewable energy within their city. And what they're doing is being creative. They're using the levers that are available to them to achieve it, most important of which is control over waste streams. So the philosophy really changing in the last few years. Rather than seeing waste as a problem to be disposed of in the cheapest and quickest way possible, waste is now increasingly being seen as a resource by major cities, starting actually in Latin America, where there have been very big carbon credit-funded landfill gas capture programs, which are at the kind of least efficient, least effective of the waste-to-energy treatments, but nevertheless address an immediate need in those cities. And the chart at the figure at the bottom is just showing you that at the moment there are 13 cities within the C40 that have got those programs in place. But increasingly where emphasis is going is into the broader and more effective use of waste streams, in particular the use of anaerobic digestion to create energy from food and other organic waste, and the use of gasification and other methods to create gas without incineration from waste streams. And we've been working in Sao Paulo to try and move on from their current system there, where they have now generated 7% of the city's electricity through the gas that they capture from their massive landfills, which is a huge achievement, to now trying to look at how in the favela areas, which are the slum areas in Sao Paulo, where about 1 million people live, and at present there's no real waste collection on an organised basis, but a huge quantity produced, major social health problems around the failure to deal with that waste at the moment. And so we've been looking there with them at creating programs that will have local collection of the waste, treatment through small-scale energy to waste in the form of anaerobic digestion, because about 3/4 of the waste is organic, with that energy then used directly into the favela areas, which at the moment just sort of steal most of their electricity from the grid, and potentially for that to be community owned and sold on. There's a bit of a sort of story in here, however, in behind the current scheme, in that one of the problems in trying to do that in Sao Paulo is that they've, through the clean development mechanism, they've got themselves locked into a contract with a Dutch firm, in this case, who came along and offered to create this wonderful energy from waste system for them, paid them 20 million euros to do it, but for the very good reason that they broke even on their investment within 12 months of putting it in place, and have a 25-year contract to manage all of the city's waste, which means they're sitting on a gold mine going forward, and the city now is locked into this rather inefficient form of energy generation. And that's a problem in many of the cities that we work with, that the international financing mechanisms that are available don't necessarily push cities in the most efficient direction. So I want to finish with, I've focused very deliberately on the things where cities really are taking lots of action at the moment and where the emphasis is. I want to finish on a few which are rising up the agenda, but at which there's little activity at the moment, but there perhaps needs to be. And food supply for me is the most important. Obviously, it's critical to the functioning of any city. It's rarely thought about in any structured way. It's just assumed that kind of food will always be available to be supplied into cities externally from agricultural land. But actually the figures which one sees at the moment is that a declining level of food production per capita, which is now being sustained for over a decade due to rapidly rising population, but also the deterioration in the quality of large amounts of agricultural land through the intensive farming methods of the last few decades, and that will be exacerbated by climate change, with some of the most fertile parts of the world becoming less agriculturally productive. It's also, perhaps from Copenhagen's view, interesting to note that while Copenhagen usually ranks right at the top of the rankings amongst cities for its low carbon emissions, if you measure those carbon emissions purely on the basis of those which are produced within the city boundaries, if you instead take a measure of the sort of broader ecological footprint, taking into account all of the resources that are consumed by Copenhageners but produced elsewhere, Copenhagen is one of the worst cities in the world, just because you're very wealthy and have very high standard of living. And actually quite a big part of that is your diet, I'm afraid. A very meat-intensive diet, which doesn't do a lot for your carbon footprint. And so when one looks at the carbon cost of food, the thing that people normally focus on is the transport and the food miles, which is important. But actually far more important is the use of energy to produce crops and to power the machinery that makes agriculture work, and then the use of fossil fuels in fertilizers. So we've been working in China in particular in how one can create, in this case, newly developed cities that have very low and sustainable ecological footprints, including the issue of food supply. This is, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but Wanzhang Eco City, which was a project that Arup wasn't involved with initially, but was brought in because the design was not seen to be tremendously radical by the client, and we were asked to reconsider it. It was a city that was going to be displace about 340,000 hectares of farmland and all of the jobs associated with that, and have virtually no agricultural production associated with it. We've been able to redesign it so that, I have to check my notes on this because it's not a project I've been personally involved with, but redesign it so that the same level of agricultural production could continue, but within the boundaries of the city, so effectively urban agriculture, not merely sustaining but increasing the number of jobs within the agricultural sector, and making the city effectively self-reliant for food and based on organic low-carbon farming, which shows that it can be done if you're starting from scratch and in a country that wants to have a go at doing this. And the benefits of that approach, which are detailed here: significant increase in potential food production, per capita income increased because you weren't making such a large number of people unemployed, but very significant reductions in carbon emissions and indeed water use, because the pattern of agriculture within the urban form would be, using modern methods, would be less intensive. So food production, one issue. At the other sort of end of the scale is the sort of notion of the smart city, which has got sort of gets lots of sort of talk in the kind of conferences that I attend, but actually relatively little action. Very few cities are really using technology to try and achieve their sustainability agendas. Melbourne's a city that we've been working in as part of the C40 to try and do something different. And in fact, the interesting thing here was we were asked by the mayor to focus on the use of technology because the political climate in Australia meant that the mayor didn't think he could do anything that was very radical to tackle climate change without facing electoral backlash. This is a year and a half or so ago. And therefore wanted to try and find policies that could make a radical difference in people's energy use, but wouldn't be unpopular, wouldn't be congestion pricing, wouldn't be trying to get people out their cars or changing the places in which they lived. So what we looked at was putting in very extensive sort of smart grid infrastructure that allows energy generators to understand in some detail how energy is being consumed across the whole of the city, and therefore to be able to balance loads and reduce peak energy requirements through better knowledge, but most importantly to give the citizens in Melbourne a much greater understanding of their own energy consumption. So smart meters in their home that tell them in real time how much energy they're using, how much it's costing them, and how much carbon emissions it's generating. And one of the things that we looked at there is taken from San Francisco, where actually the city there, to try and to deal with its congestion problem, did a significant analysis of the vehicle movements within the central business district, found that in the morning peak, a large proportion of cars that were circulating had actually arrived at their destination. They just couldn't find anywhere to park. They then analysed the available parking spaces and found to their surprise that actually there were slightly more parking spaces available than the number of cars that needed them. It's just the drivers didn't know where the parking spaces were at the right time. So they put sensors in all of the parking spaces around the city centre, made available to the market all of their transport data that enabled a number of companies to come up with phone apps that now tell drivers who've signed up to the service when they're within 200 metres or so of a parking space. They get that information exclusively for a short period of time and are able to drive straight to them at the nearest spot. The initial results show a reduction in congestion of about 10%, which is a huge change for relatively little cost. But perhaps at the other end of the scale is simply through, if one works on the basis that people make poor decisions because they have bad information, we're all incredibly wasteful in our use of energy, largely because we don't really think about what it's costing, what it's doing to the planet, what it's doing to our own pocket. This is a project that a colleague of mine was working on in Helsinki, which I think is rather beautiful, to try and get a neighbourhood to understand the impact of their own energy consumption. They simply fired a laser onto the smokestack of the nearby power station, and the size of the beautiful sort of green circle changes as people use energy. And so they observed, and once people knew about this, they observed people sort of turning off the lights in their building and looking out the window to see if they changed the size. And over a period of time, it's a kind of fun way, but it has had some impact on people's energy use. And that's been followed through now in a project called Low to No, which is a new low-carbon development outside of Helsinki, where every single building is going to be sort of smart, so that each citizen knows their energy use within their own building. But also that data will be taken by the community, and there'll be fun things like this. So when you go to one of the walls outside of the neighbourhood, touch your hand on the wall and it will show you the size of your own carbon footprint, and you can measure that against your friends and neighbours to try and get a kind of friendly competition. and this is the point I made earlier, whilst there's a lot of talk around all of this sort of smart thing, actually there's very little action. So this is one of the measurements we did in the C40. Only 4 cities are actually undertaking smart metering at the moment. The opportunity for them to do so is very significant. Another 23 cities have got the powers that would enable them to impose those across the city. So I think I must have run out of time here, in which case I might skip.
I will allow you to go on just a little bit.
Okay. With your permission then, I will very briefly. Because everything I've focused on so far has been in the context of climate change, but has really been about reducing carbon footprint. But actually for many of the cities around the world, and particularly the ones that we work with, their more immediate problem is how that they adapt to inevitable climate change, which is already happening. Ho Chi Minh ranks, according to the World Bank, as one of the 10 most threatened cities in the world from climate change, and that's largely due to the twin problems of flooding, it's a delta city, and drought in the other parts of the seasons around its agricultural lands. We've been looking at how the city can manage this rising threat, and it's a pretty dire situation. The population's rising very, very rapidly, but most of the new development is taking place on areas that are already floodplain. And our estimates are that by 2030, 90% of the occupied area of Ho Chi Minh will be at severe flood risk. And this is a city at the moment of 3.4 million people. So the only real choices available to them are major infrastructural changes. Everything from a massive new dam through to creating fully permeable surfaces across their roads and pavements, massive underground water storage. Indeed, one of the things that we're looking at is turning some of their underground road tunnels into potential flood runoff. But also a redesign of the city, because the real problem that the city has is it's eliminated its natural flood plains by building on them, and all of the areas along the major rivers have been built up. And so the main sort of focus actually is how do you change that pattern of development and shift the properties back away from the river, and in the process create a much more livable city, a much nicer place to live with some real green space and some fresh air. I'll skip that, but that's the sort of things that cities are doing. So just to finish, I'm very positive about what's happening at the moment in these big cities. These sort of steps is the change in activity across these C40 cities over the last 5 years. And the really good thing for me is that over half of all the actions that have been taken around climate change have been in the last 2 years. And if that acceleration continues, then these cities will start to get on the right road towards delivering their targets. However, at the moment, not a single one of the single city that I've worked in is actually anywhere near to its avowed climate target, and that's really for 2 reasons. The first, this is an illustration of some work we did in the city of Toronto, is the difficulty of marrying necessary policy measures on sustainability with citizens' aspirations. We spent a few weeks in Toronto working on how to redesign this neighbourhood called the Peanut. This is actually an image from the 1940s before it was built up, but it's called the Peanut because of its rather strange shape of its peanut shape of its road network. But it's a kind of typical inner sort of suburb of Toronto. Mix of housing from high-rise to detached housing. Most people travel by car, pretty wealthy because Toronto's pretty wealthy, very high energy use, one of the top energy use within the C40. Radical mayor who wants to massively cut their carbon emissions. So we spent a week or so and then 2 intensive days with the community going through all the different options for how they could change their community. At the end of which, the feedback from them was absolutely fantastic. They filled in all the feedback forms, best thing we've ever been at, absolutely wonderful, so great that you're asking our views on this. But they didn't want to change anything. Not a single thing that we proposed did they want to do. And that was because they like their life as it is. They're very happy with their lifestyle, but they would be very happy. They would be even happier if they had a low carbon lifestyle, but they don't want to have to do anything to change anything to make it happen. And that's the real tough problem for politicians. The second one, I think, is the one that I alluded to earlier, which is city government is, in most places, works on the basis of inertia. It does what it's always done, and it kind of plods along. And the political cycle means it's very difficult to think about things for the long term. And city governments are really set up to manage existing infrastructure, not really to, you know, cities have generally kind of grown organically and evolved rather than been planned. But there's really no way that you can achieve the sort of change that's necessary to build sustainability in the future, and particularly to tackle climate change, if you don't plan how your city is going to develop. Really think through in a very integrated and strategic way how that infrastructure fits together. And with the exception of places like Copenhagen, that's a real problem for most cities in the world, and that's the one they've really got to crack. The positive thing for me is through organisations like the C40, those cities are now trying to learn from the real leaders, and I hope that in a few years when I go to places and give an example of something that really works in Copenhagen, I won't get the response that, well, that's Copenhagen, that's different. You know, people will think that they actually can do the same sort of things that you do here. With that, I better stop. Thank you very much.